Well, it was welcome news today when the pro-Palestinian protest group planning to crash the Myer Christmas windows unveiling in Melbourne CBD backed down following public backlash. But with the splinter group crash the Christmas windows, threatening to disrupt the long-standing family tradition if the department store went ahead with its plans to launch on Sunday, Myer has now again called off the event. It was on, it was off, it was on, it's now off again. Now, this protest group has said children in Australia shouldn't have more rights to enjoy Christmas than the children in Palestine. Honestly, how does this stuff help anyone in the Middle East? Well, tonight, to help me unpack it all and maybe explain that to me, is Liberal MP for Bourke, Julian Leeser. Julian, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thanks,
I'm
Caroline.
confused as to where the latest is, but for the moment it seems the protesters have won and the launch event is off. This is now the second Christmas in a row that pro-Palestinian protesters have become the Grinches, trying to ruin events aimed at kids. Australians are sick of this, aren't they?
I think they're heartily sick of it, Caroline. I mean, we want to get our cities back. Christmas is a time of joy for people. People love going down to see the Christmas displays that are on in supermarket windows. I remember myself going with my mum, my grandmother on the train, as many Australians did in Sydney, to the equivalent window displays, and you're excited every year to see this. Christmas should be a time of joy for Australians, not a time for protest. And I think Australians are increasingly fed up with the way in which these pro-Palestine protesters conduct themselves. I mean, these are the people that yesterday painted and attacked the electorate office of my colleague in Brisbane, Ross Vasta. These are the people that engage in, graffitiing Jewish businesses. They're the people at the land forces protests that threw doorknobs and cans and chairs at police and tried to harm horses who were there as part of keeping the peace. We're looking in Australia, I think, a bit of a laughing stock. It's time our government and it's time the authorities actually took the side of law-abiding Australians and allowed people to celebrate Christmas, to enjoy the joy of Christmas like they've always done here, instead of constantly bowing down to these minority protesters.
Well, speaking of government, the Victorian Premier Jacinta Allen was part of the backlash to those threats to protest. She tweeted, "I am furious that a small group of people have chosen to politicise a beautiful event for children. I'm just as mad at all the others who have quietly stoked this division and egged them on." But hang on, Julian, there have been weekly protests now in Melbourne and here in Sydney, where we are, for more than a year. And what have these state and federal governments actually done about them?
Well, I want to see more than just tweets from the state premiers. I want to see them directing the police to enforce the laws at these protests. I mean, at a number of these protests, you've had people glorifying terrorist organisations. I mean, when we list terrorist organisations in this country like Hamas and Hezbollah, that should mean something. That should mean that people shouldn't be able to protest in favour of their actions. They shouldn't be able to hold up pictures of their leaders. They shouldn't be able to pretend that they're not protesting in their favour when they actually are. And it's time the law was enforced. We've got a crisis of law enforcement in this country, and whether it's the state authorities or the federal authorities, people have failed to actually let law-abiding Australians go about their business. And we've been seeing this since the 9th of October last year with those dreadful Opera House protests. Enough is enough. It's time for the Federal Attorney Mark Dreyfus, for the Federal Home Affairs Minister to exercise their powers, as it is time for the state premiers and the state Attorney Generals and police ministers to direct the police to actually take strong action here and restore the streets to the law-abiding.
Well, maybe this is a hint as to how the government has emboldened these protesters. Tell me if I'm right here. The federal government has been accused of deception after abandoning a long-time bipartisan position to vote in favour of Palestinian sovereignty over natural resources in the occupied territories of the UN. Now, Anthony Albanese said before the election there'd be no change in the Middle East position under a Labor government. But we've now reversed our position 5 times in the past 2 years. The government seems increasingly hostile to the Jewish state. Julian, why is this latest betrayal so disappointing?
Well, I think our foreign policy should be based on values. And there was a barefaced lie told to the Jewish community before the last election that there'd be no difference between the Labor Party and the coalition on Israel and the Jewish community. And what we've seen for the Labor Party, even before the 7th of October, has been backsliding repeatedly in relation to Israel, whether it's increasing the funding to UNRWA and restoring the funding to UNRWA, as they've done repeatedly, whether it was failing to recognise and maintain the position of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and as you point out, several United Nations votes where Labor has stood not with our traditional ally, not with our most important ally, the United States, on these matters, and not in accordance with our values, standing with a similar Western liberal democracy. Instead, they've tried to insert themselves to deal with issues that have always been regarded as final status issues in this country. I think we're sending a terrible signal right around the world that our foreign policy is going to be dictated by the internal machinations and power struggles within the Labor Party rather than what is in Australia's long-term national interests.
You know, we've seen Donald Trump's new administration already, a lot of pro-Israel hawks on there. I mean, it seems that the gap is widening between Australia's position and the US when it comes to the Middle East. Do you foresee this being an issue in our relations with the US?
Well, I think it is. I mean, you have to remember the Biden administration is still in power, and the Biden administration did not vote with Australia here at this particular UN resolution. And yes, the Trump administration is going to be stronger in relation to Israel. It was Donald Trump's signature policy was the Abraham Accords, which have had a transformative and really positive effect on the Middle East. And I'm hoping that he will crack on with more of that. And if Australia is adopting this sort of 1970s style anti-Israel policy, increasingly we will put ourselves at odds with our most important ally.
Yeah, that's the worry, isn't it? Okay, Julian Leeser, thank you so much for your time tonight.